Welcome to State of Ed, a podcast about education inside the classroom and out. My name is Marc.
And I'm Nick Simone.
How are you today, Nick?
Doing well, Mark. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well myself. Thank you for asking. I'm very excited. Today we have a really wonderful guest, and I've been looking forward to speaking with him for a couple of weeks now since he was kind enough to agree to come on the show. So without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jared Fox, who is the LGBT Community Liaison for the New York City Department of Education. So Jared, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, happy to be here.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
very
much for
much.
taking the time. We're really looking forward to this.
So, can you start by just talking about how you became the LGBT community liaison for the New York City Department of Ed?
So, the role of being an LGBT community liaison is pretty new for school systems, and the position was created in January of 2016 in response to a request from a city council person. There was an openly gay chair of the City Council Education Committee, Danny Drum, and he said, you know what, we've got to have a full-time role dedicated to LGBT issues. And instead of waiting around for somebody to create that role, he actually funded it through the City Council's budget, and I was hired in January of 2016. And since then, the position has been baselined from the New York City Department of Ed, but it's been a fun time trying to create this position from scratch.
Well, I was going to ask, are you a pioneer doing this, or are there other cities or departments of education elsewhere around the country that have something that you can model after, or is this really coming from scratch?
So it's a pretty new position. I mean, there have been people that have done LGBT work in other school districts, but there really hasn't been a full-time dedicated position that's only job is to serve as a subject matter expert and to facilitate the types of programs that I do. Like I said, it's been a hat that people wear, not the whole costume.
Mhm.
So, who do you directly report to anybody?
So within the Department of Education, I actually work within the Division of Operations and the Office of Safety and Youth Development.
Okay.
So there are lots of youth development programs that we have across the city. One of our biggest programs in New York City is our Respect for All program, which ensures that students are affirmed and valued regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, race, class, religion, lots of different categories. And so that Respect for All program has existed for a number of years. This role is sort of a complement to that work and takes a specific approach to just the LGBT issues.
And did
So,
you have any involvement with the Board of Ed in any other capacity prior to this job?
yeah, so I've been working for the New York City Department of Ed for almost 6 years now.
Okay.
Prior to this role, I was in the Division of Instructional and Information Technology. I was actually a strategist. I helped to um, mastermind and think behind some of the instructional tech that teachers use in the classroom. And so I did a lot of training, and I helped to create our single point of contact, or SPOC program, which is one tech person in every school that oversees the tech issues. And now what I've been able to do is really take my work from technology and apply it to LGBT stuff. So we are looking at developing programs that similarly have an LGBT point person in a school. We saw how successful that was for technology. Why not recreate it?
Were you doing curriculum-based technology or more hardware-based? And
Both. So that's the interesting part of my role is I had to kind of shred of both, because all you hear from a teacher is my internet's slow, but they don't understand what that actually means. What is bandwidth? Why is the
right.
teacher down the hallway streaming a show on Netflix on their off period actually slowing down their internet for their students?
Oh.
What is all that connecting? So I came from a very unique world because I speak tech, but I also speak teacher because I was a high school English teacher as well before that. So, and I was a high school English teacher in New Orleans, Louisiana, with a program called Teach for America.
Right.
And so I was down south teaching high school English and had a great time. It was fantastic, and moved to New York about 5 years ago to do this tech work with the Department of Ed.
Wow. Well, I'm impressed. Your qualifications across the board are tremendous. That's great. You have such an incredible balance of your talents to fulfill this role.
Thanks.
So how did you wind up going from that one world into this somewhat related but in many ways completely different world?
Yeah, so it's so funny because technology works when it wants to work, and some schools are great with it, and some schools aren't. And for LGBT students, it's not a matter of working or not working, but we see some schools are really great with LGBT issues, and some schools
Mm-hmm.
need some additional assistance.
Mm-hmm.
And for many years, schools have relied on outside nonprofits and community based organizations for that support. And I was really lucky that I was working for the past 3 or 4 years with a New York City based nonprofit called GLISTEN, which is the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. And prior to taking on the role as the LGBT Community Liaison, I was doing this work as part of a community based organization. And so I started and was running the New York City chapter of GLISTEN, and then this position became available, and I had already been really doing LGBT education work in New York City. And this was just being able to do it from the inside out. And I've noticed a really big difference in the way that people treat you from coming in versus coming from the outside. And I've seen both sides of it.
Can you describe the difference?
Yeah, so when you're with a community based organization, you're trying to advocate for those kids. You may call a principal and say, hey, I'd like to offer training or offer a PD for your staff. They can't make you come in, right? Whereas if I call, I come from the Department of Ed. So
Right.
it's almost like I have that internal seal of approval. And
Hmm.
so they're like, oh, okay, maybe we can trust this guy. He's got our best
He's one of
interests
the
in
good
mind.
guys.
Yeah, and I think by and large, whenever I've worked with principals, schools, families, anybody, they really see me as a third party. I like to think of myself as sort of, um, I don't know, this third party person that doesn't. My job is to just make sure everybody understands the policies, is doing the best thing for the kids.
Hmm.
That's where we're coming at it from.
It must have helped that you were at least very familiar with the New York City schools prior to this job, because I always find the New York City schools so overwhelming on any level. And to go into a brand new job, and if you had no experience with the schools, that would have been
I don't think the person who would have filled this role couldn't have been somebody who didn't know the New York City
right.
Department of Ed.
Yeah.
It just wouldn't be possible. But I also think it really gives me a leg up that I was an educator, so I know what teachers are facing. When I was in the tech world, I was working a lot with principals. I was working with coaches. I was working with instructional leads. I was working with APs. And I was working with Central. So I've gotten to see things from lots of different avenues. And now I really just apply that to my work on LGBT issues, is trying to figure out what does everybody need in this situation so that we can just keep going on.
So let's talk about that because there are obviously many changes going on throughout the school systems really across the country, and like you said a moment ago, some people are catching on quickly and some people are not. And perhaps one of the things that is a barrier to entry, so to speak, is the new vocabulary that is required for people to know and understand and be fluent in. So, can you take us through some of that new vocabulary that people, or maybe not so new vocabulary, but might be new to some people, that they should have a familiarity with for the teachers and administrators who are listening?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, it's that acronym LGBT. And I think what we should do is take the L, G, and B and look at them first. So lesbian, gay, and bisexual. Those three identities are what we call a sexual orientation. And sexual orientation is not just sexual. And that's, I think, where a lot of people get hung up as they see gay or lesbian or bisexual and they just assume sex. And I think it's important to note that everybody has a sexual. Straight is a sexual orientation. Heterosexual. So when we talk about sexual orientation, it's physical, it's romantic, it's spiritual. And I always ask people when we're talking about sexual orientation to think about what you like about your significant other, if I'm talking to a straight person.
Hmm.
And oftentimes they'll list things like, well, I like that they're honest and trustworthy and make me laugh. that none of that has to do with sex. And
Right.
so what I say is sexual orientation is everything before the sex, is all of the other stuff that you like about somebody else, all combined. And it just so happens that you're attracted to people of a certain sex. And we have many people, a lot of young people that have come up with new sexual orientations that maybe we didn't have words to describe before. So I think a lot about asexual students and asexual individuals who are individuals where sex is not the primary component in their relationship. They want a long term loving relationship, but it's just not focused on sex. Sex may not even be something they're interested in.
Hmm.
So that's sexual orientation. Now, the T, transgender, gets looped in with sexual orientation because, and I'll use myself as an example, growing up being gay, people didn't necessarily pick on me because I liked other men. It was because I didn't fit the archetype of masculinity that they wanted me to be. So, because I wasn't masculine enough, my gender expression wasn't fitting what they thought it needed to be,
Hmm.
they then picked on me. And so when we talk about trans individuals, we're really talking about gender identity and gender expression. And everybody has one of those too. So everybody has a gender identity, which is your internal sense of being more male or more female. And everybody has a gender expression, which is whether they express themselves more masculine, more feminine, a little bit of both, or neither. And I think that last part, what I said, is that both or neither often trips people up. So much of our school system is dedicated and etched in stone about sort of being just boys and girls, male and female. But then we realize that there are many young people that fall between, and then there are many young people that refuse to be a part of even that whole system, that they're kind of both, or they might be neither. And so we have a lot of young people that fall outside of that system. And we use terms like gender nonconforming, gender creative, gender liberated. I
Hmm.
prefer gender liberated because it really defines who those young people are. They've said, I'm going to be liberated and not sit in the box that you've tried to put me in for so long. So I
Hmm.
hope that helps when we talk about sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, transgender, and then and gender nonconforming or gender liberated. And then one last term that I'll throw out there is this idea of being cisgender. And so we
Hmm.
focus so much on transgender without realizing that there's a word to describe people who are not transgender, and that
Hmm.
word is cisgender. And that means that you were born in the body, your gender matches the body in which you were born in. And you don't want to change that. You fit within that binary system, and you're perfectly comfortable being where you're at. And
Hmm.
that's not a problem. The problem comes in when people who are cisgender uh, try to put people in the same box that they feel most comfortable in. And
Hmm.
it doesn't fit for everybody.
Well, that is, I guess probably the most difficult thing to overcome is that for very, very long time, we as a society have sort of inherently put people into boxes or into conforming groups, and they've been very binary, and that has existed for a long time. Even though we now know the reality that under the surface it truly wasn't that way, but it was purported that way.
But Mark,
Everything on television reflected that. Everything in literature reflected that. Everything in movies reflected that. In our, or at least the conventional interpretations of those things. But we now know as a hopefully more advanced and understanding and tolerant society that wasn't always the case, even though it was sort of, like I said, purported to be that way.
I think one of the important things, though, is that these things that we try to think are so historically relevant and are the way that they've always been are not the way they've always been. And so
Right.
when I talk to people, I often talk about high heels. People think of high heels as stereotypically female identified apparel, right? High heels are only for women. But any great history teacher knows the importance that high heels played as an instrument of war. That men wore high heels going into battle so that they could get higher up on the stirrups. So high heels were not always worn by women. In fact, many kings, you'll see these elaborate photos of kings who are not only wearing high heels, but wigs and makeup. And that's all the way into the early 1900s, that these were instruments of being able to show status and class, not necessarily gender. People think pink is a girl color and blue is a boy color, but toy manufacturers in the early 1900s, there's this great advertisement out there that shows that toy manufacturers were encouraged to make girls' toys blue and boys' toys pink because pink was a more dominant, assertive color. And so these things that we hold so dear and we get so offended about people upsetting are new inventions. And they're exactly that, they're inventions. We've created the system of boxes and structures and hierarchy. And oftentimes, sadly, it's to hold who we think are female identified individuals back.
As I listen to your very detailed and impressive description of all of the different variations, right away I just think about how kids have to fill out applications that say male and female. Like that's the first thing that comes to mind. Something that must be so uncomfortable for so many people.
Well, and it's not just for trans individuals that
Right.
checking that box of male and female is uncomfortable. The Common App, though, recognizing this, has made a switch to the Common application this year. So educators will have a new question that students will be asked, and it asks them their sex that they were assigned at birth.
Okay.
That's a very different way of asking, are you male or female? They want to know whether or not you were assigned male or female at birth. And that's important for a number of reasons.
Right.
But it's getting people to talk about the bodies we were born in as opposed to sex being something that is static forever.
Yeah, I thought I read that Harvard got rid of it on its application. I
They may
could be
have-
wrong.
Yeah, they may have. I don't spend a lot of time in the higher
Right.
ed space. I concentrate and live in the K to 12 spectrum. And that's really where a lot of this work starts.
Right.
Because those kids
mean-
become adults.
Yeah, I mean, from a teaching standpoint, a long time ago, I just completely, I'm not even sure if I ever did, I just stopped when you would break up the class into teams. So often teachers will say, all right, boys and girls, males, females. And I stopped that a long time ago, only because I just thought it was reinforcing stereotypes, not realizing that it probably made a lot of kids uncomfortable to do that.
And we line kids up in lines that are
Right.
essentially based on their genitalia.
Elementary school. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, but when I tell teachers, what about if you're a computer teacher and you lined kids up into two lines, bits and bytes, or different parts of a keyboard, right? You had a line that was motherboard and a line that was RAM. What about if you were studying cloud formations and you had lines that were cumulus, stratus, and nimbus, right? What would it look like to line your kids up, not on their genitalia, but on the academic content you're teaching? And for those kids, it's not just the lines, but it's everything we see in the world. It's when they go to buy clothes, girls have clothes about being gorgeous and pretty, and you see shirts that have bedazzled, sparkling letters that say, pretty or gorgeous, and yet boys have shirts that say things like, I love dinosaurs and rocks, and, getting kids to think about careers in science. And then we wonder why we don't have more females in STEM fields. And the reality is, is because, not because women are inherently worse at STEM, but because everything we've sold to them, from the clothes on their back to the subjects that they study in school to the way that they're treated, is that they don't belong in that field.
Right. You're really speaking to stereotype thread and how that has an impact psychologically on people and how they perform. I saw a speaker from Columbia, a professor at Columbia, who had done a lot of research on stereotype threat, and they concluded, which was absolutely confounding and amazing to me, just to prove this point, that right before students took like a AP calculus exam, they asked the students to fill in their, basically their paperwork, their gender identity first, and then they took the test. And that the control group basically didn't have to do that until the test was over. And the females who took the test um, far outperformed the females who took the test who indicated or checked the box female before they took the test, which really supported the fact that it just reminded them for that one brief second, oh, wait a second, I'm a female, I'm not supposed to be good at this particular thing that I'm about to sit down and do, versus asking them to check that box after. And to me, that really was an amazing, kind of hit the point home for me, to talk about the power of stereotype threat and the impact that it does have on
So
performance.
gender bias is real, right? And it exists for lots of people. And I talk about it because I think many people who are cisgender, right, non-trans people, know it. They know it really well. They may have lived through it. Their significant other may have lived through it. Um, they may know the very real effects of women getting paid less than men in the United States. And so, what does this have to do with LGBT people? Well, the reality is, if you're trans, right, your body is telling this a certain narrative to society, but your gender, right, who you are on the inside, is telling you a
Mhm.
completely different narrative. And
Right.
for those young people, and I'm dealing more and more with kindergarten, first, second, third grade kids who are asserting their trans identity. They are then having to jump that aisle. And they're having to go against everything that everybody says they should be, based solely off the body they were born in, to be who they truly are. If we let kids just be kids, imagine what that would be like.
It'd be a great place.
I think that would, and where else is a better place but school? I mean, that's what school's supposed to be.
Um, I don't know if you feel if you can answer this, but how receptive have teachers been to your work? How receptive have administrators? Have you had backlash from parents? And again, if you don't feel comfortable answering it, don't
No,
worry about it.
I think that the response has by and large been thank you for your help. I think there's been a big question about, you know, what what is when are we going to have an office or multiple people? I'm one person for 1,800
Right.
schools and over 1.1 million kids.
Wow.
But this work isn't about one person. This work is about the whole
Right.
Department of Ed. So a lot of my work is about capacity building. And I think that has been really interesting and telling. I think by and large, people feel like this is a part of their work, but they just don't know the steps to take. And so we have a,
So how do you build that capacity in
yeah,
schools?
it's essentially teaching people how to think, not what to think. I can't give somebody a handbook on transgender students, but what I can do is help them to understand that the student's voice is paramount in these conversations and that we listen to the students because they're the experts on how they're feeling and what they need to be successful. It's not telling them, okay, and if you have a trans kid, here's step A, step B, step C.
Hmm. Hmm.
There are policies, definitely. There are certain standards of care. But we've got to treat everybody the way that they really do want to be treated.
So what's your way into a school building? Is it through the clinicians and the counselors? Do you go to the building administrators? How do you attack and approach, building by building?
I think, not I think, I do. It really is dependent on who's contacting me. So sometimes I get a call from a student or a parent. Sometimes I get an email from a principal who says, hey, we could use a staff training or we need an additional help in this area. It is different in every case in every different scenario. So there's no one size fits all. Sometimes I come in and people don't want me to be there because they know that I'm only there because something went wrong. And
Mhm.
and I don't think that anybody wakes up in the morning saying, I want to hurt LGBT kids. I think a lot of it is just thinking that they know the exact right things to do and it not being the right thing. And so sometimes what I get is, I'm sorry, I totally didn't know that I was supposed to do this or that. Thanks for helping me. It's not been like I did this wrong or did this right. It's been sort of, I'm learning, and we're all learning. This is not something we teach in our graduate schools. It's not something we teach in all of our PD. It's new.
Yet.
Right.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you what level of contact you have with students, and I was also going to inquire about the Harvey Milk School and what success that's having, and is there, any need to maybe open up more schools like that in other boroughs?
So I think to Harvey Milk, the Harvey Milk High School was originally started by a small nonprofit called the Hetrick Martin Institute, or HMI. And HMI started the Harvey Milk High School, which is now an official DOE accredited high school, where where the Hetrick Martin Institute is their lead community partner. Now, many people think it's a high school for gay and lesbian kids, which I think is part of what you're asking, is sort of like, what it actually is, it's a transfer high school for any kid who their homeschool just hasn't fit their unique needs. It happens that many of those young people happen to be LGBT. I wish every kid had the opportunity to go to a great school right in their neighborhood. And until we're all up to speed on LGBT issues, and not just LGBT issues, but race and class and religion, I think places like Harvey Milk High School hold a very important role in this movement. They are a temporary solution to a larger systemic problem of making sure we have social justice educators. And I think we're doing a great job of that in New York City. We have a lot of teachers that really focus on social justice as a curriculum. And
You mentioned a minute ago that when you get called in, sometimes it's because something has gone wrong or something didn't go well. So, what are some of the things that you're finding are going wrong, or some of the problems that are occurring in the schools that you will later get called into?
I don't think it's a problem as much as it's just misinformation. It's people want to hear it directly from me, what's the policy, and want to be able to ask questions in a safe, nurturing environment. I think that's a lot of my role. It's not necessarily problems that are happening or somebody did anything wrong.
Okay.
I think I've had a couple cases where a kid has been bullied and maybe the school didn't know exactly what to do or how to handle it, because they thought that maybe because it dealt with LGBT issues, it needed to be treated differently. And sometimes it does. So
Right.
let's imagine I'm getting bullied for my skin color. I most likely come from a family who understands or may have similar skin tone. But if I'm being bullied because I'm gay or lesbian or even trans, I don't get to go home and talk to my mom about what it's like to be trans because she doesn't get
Right.
it. And in fact, the school may want to inform the family of the young person that they're being bullied, but that young person may not be out at home. And by telling that family, they're opening that young person up for what could be a really disastrous situation. So it's a tricky area. It's a sensitive area.
So could you take us through the rules and regulations that exist, not just the chancellor's regs in DOE, but maybe on the state level or even federal level that have been put into place to provide support and protection for the LGBT students?
Yeah, so in New York State, there's what we call the Dignity for All Students Act, which was our anti-bullying bill that was passed at a state level. It was really meant to make sure that we were taking bullying very seriously, realizing that bullying doesn't stop when the school bell rings and the kids leave, because we're in a technology age. Bullying can happen anytime, day, night, 24/7,
That is
365.
right. Absolutely.
So DASA understood that cyberbullying is bullying. It understood that our first goal as educators is to educate, so we never try to go right to punishment. We really try to educate and provide guidance based interventions. But we also understand that sometimes the victim may be in a place where their family cannot know because it could potentially open them up for further repercussions. So
Hmm.
DASA recognizes all of those things. So one of the things I would tell all educators is if you're dealing with a case of bullying, the first thing is to document it and report it. The second thing is to investigate it. Because sometimes you'll figure out there are many sides to a story, and what may feel very personal and like bullying may not be in the end. Or what may look
Right.
on the surface as just kids being kids is actually a deeply rooted case of bullying.
Hmm.
And then I think it's about supporting the young person. So when we talk about young people wanting to tell their families that they might be LGBT, and the school has a role in that, in really supporting that conversation. But the school shouldn't be outing a kid. That is
Right.
definitely not the role of the Dignity for All Students Act. For transgender students specifically, we have the New York State Transgender Guidelines, which were a set of guidelines that the New York State Education Department put out. And this was before any federal guidance. This was before the Obama Dear Colleague letter that has been in the news so much. This was New York State saying this is what's right. And it governs everything from records to names and pronouns. And what it says, one of the biggest things, is that a student has a right to be referred to by the preferred name and preferred pronouns. And a lot of educators think that they need to get parent permission, or they
Hmm.
can't call you that because that's not your official name. When a student says, I want to be called blank because when you call me this other name, it hurts me, and you continue to do something that hurts that kid,
Right. Right.
that is a form of harassment. It really, a kid has said that hurts when you say that, and yet you think you need parent permission to not hurt a child?
Yeah, several of my students that are in college said that when they went around the first day of school, that the professors did that, asked for preferred pronouns, and that was a little bit surprising to them. I think they were tolerant and understanding. Do you think that's something that needs to be transferred down to the high school level already?
So I have very mixed feelings about those pronoun circles. I think on the one hand, it gets people talking about pronouns that
Right.
might have what I call pronoun privilege, being that everybody would look at them and they would know the pronouns they pick. They've never had to announce their pronouns to a group of people.
Hmm.
Then you have young people who identify as trans, gender liberated, who those pronoun activities are to make everybody else aware of those people's pronouns. So when you go around the circle and you have somebody who looks like me, right? I have a beard, I wear male clothing, I present as a male, I think. Um, Everybody's going to look and say, okay, he uses he, him, and his. But somebody who looks
Hmm.
like me, who may identify as trans or gender liberated, who wants to use she and her, or even the
Hmm.
singular they and them pronoun, or may have another pronoun that they prefer, what happens then immediately is everybody looks at them as if, like, whoa, some part of
Hmm.
this equation isn't adding up. So
Hmm.
I prefer asking students in a confidential, personal way. I always was a big fan of the first day of school student surveys, but I also would frequently survey my students to ask them their opinions on what was happening. And I would also ask them for updates. Are there changes to your preferred name and pronouns that you feel comfortable telling me? Because the first day,
Hmm.
I might not be ready to roll up in your classroom and say, hey, Mr. Fox, I'm here and I'm trans and this
Yeah.
is my name and
Right.
pronouns. But 3 months
Right.
in, when I've developed a culture and a respect, that young person
Hmm.
may feel like I'm the only person they can tell that to.
Right. I would hope that they could also have that kind of relationship with their counselor, because the counselor really could play a huge role in making sure that that is that kind of respect is being played out in every single classroom, and that not only just your classroom because you happen to be someone that they feel your room is a safe room to kind of discuss, or you're a safe person to discuss those things with. Um, yeah, I would really hope in this case that there would be more of a team approach, because otherwise, everyone in each individual classroom is in some way reinventing the wheel with that student.
Mark, I think, wanted to ask you about the role of social workers and guidance counselors. And as I'm thinking about it, there's probably nowhere near enough of these people to provide these services for the kids.
So, social workers and guidance counselors in New York City have a lot on their plate. They are definitely really amazing resources. We have a program in New York City called Single Shepherd that is giving schools in 2 districts the opportunity to have a 1 to 100 caseload ratio. So social workers or
That's
guidance
great.
counselors in those districts, in middle school and high school, it is 1 guidance counselor or 1 social worker to every 100 kids, which is an
That's amazing.
unheard of ratio. And what we're
Yeah.
seeing is really great things. I think it's really too early to tell and have strong data on it, but we know that one of the key indicators to success is having a great guidance counselor or social worker. And so in these 2 districts, one in Brooklyn and one in the Bronx, we're seeing what it would look like to decrease that ratio and give kids more time and allow counselors to be counselors and social workers to be social workers.
Mm.
That's tremendous.
Yeah. Well, it costs money. I mean, just like, to create your position, which is an incredible idea, costs money, and perhaps one of the reasons that there aren't an army of people in your position is because it's doesn't have the funding, and there might be there are other things at play, but
But let's be honest. Money is spent on a lot of frivolous things,
I
right?
agree.
You add up, and I taught in Louisiana, and so I'll use Louisiana as an example because I'm no longer working in that school district. But I remembered we went in a room. It was a book room, and there had to have been close to 40 or 50,000 workbooks that were meant as student consumable resources that were supposed to be handed out every year, that were part of an old book that we got a new book. We had to order new books every 4 or 5 years because the information was updated. And those books are expensive. I actually think some of those social studies textbooks that some of those teachers had to use were more expensive than a new iPad. And what would it have looked like for us to transform education in that way? I think Louisiana's reason for not having LGBT liaisons is not necessarily the money, and more
right.
of a mindset thing. Is they don't see
Right.
how this position can save kids' lives, and I think that's where we're moving towards. We're having to get young people's lives to the front of the conversation.
Well, I completely agree, and I think Mark and I's next show is going to be textbooks or no textbooks. What's the answer?
But you brought up an excellent point, Jared, and have you seen in the last week since our election any type of change in tone in terms of the students that you're in contact with, or the counselors, or the building administration that you're in contact with when it comes to the LGBT students?
For me, I've been my key message since the election of our president elect has been, this is business as usual. Nothing has changed immediately, and until an executive order is rescinded or a policy is put in place, my job is to go into work every day as if nothing else has changed. Because, frankly, nothing else
It hasn't.
has changed.
Hmm.
So, yes, it's a scary thought what could be coming down the pipeline. It is scary to think that there are young people who think that this will dramatically change their lives, and it may. We heard the thought of deporting X million number of people. For many Latino or Latinx students, right? Not Latino, Latina. We use Latinx to be sort of gender inclusive.
Hmm.
Uh, this is very real for them. This is their livelihood. We have many students, many of my friends, who from college who came out as undocumented in order to get deferred action. And that might be one of the first things to go. So, what does that mean for those individuals who have been legally allowed to work for several years, have been paying
Hmm.
taxes, have been law
Hmm.
abiding citizens um, for many countries? And
Right.
I think we focus on a couple specific countries, or our new administration does. Um, I think it's really interesting what we'll see in terms of First Lady's activism. So I think a lot of
Hmm.
people have been talking about Donald, but Melania has said that she really wants to focus on cyberbullying. I'm excited to partner with Melania. I hope that she's listening to your podcast. Um, and I want her to know that I would really like to partner with her on some cyberbullying resources and to increase the conversation around cyberbullying. I think, we'll see what happens. I think already we've seen things that are kind of rolled back. Um, our wall that was going to be built is now a fence. Same-sex marriage is settled. Um, I think, but I also think that we've seen Donald is not the dangerous one. It's those that he keeps in company. And this is personal
Mm.
opinions. I just want to say that for the
Sure.
record.
Sure.
Um, that we see a vice president who funded conversion therapy, that said that I could be
Mm.
electrocuted to get the gay away. That you can electrocute the gay away. And yet, that is
That's
2016.
just such scary rhetoric.
Yeah,
It's
yeah. So
yeah.
we know that it's not necessarily Donald Trump that's dangerous, but those around.
Right. And how many young people who are either, you know, debating whether or not to remain closeted, or they are considering or feeling like they are undergoing some a transition, who hear this rhetoric and feel like, okay, this is maybe I should entertain this as valid, and then wind up, either falling into significant depression or become suicidal, or God forbid act on it. I mean, this has a very real impact on lives. It's not, and that transcends the rhetoric and the ridiculousness of it. And as adults who are educated, we might be able to sort of kind of sift through and recognize what is, talk versus what is, action. But a young person, or maybe not even a young person, but certainly a younger person who is grappling with, you know living in this world and trying to, be who they are. Those kinds of ideas, that kind of ideology just strikes me as something that could be unbelievably damaging and horrendous.
It is. I mean, I work very closely with a nonprofit organization called the Trevor Project. They are a suicide resource for LGBTQ youth. That is trevorproject.org, Trevor. And they operate a call center, but they also operate an online chat as well as a texting service for young people who may or may not identify as LGBT, who are experiencing crisis. The day after the election, they saw the most volume to their calls,
Wow.
chats, and text, more than they have ever seen in all the years that they've operated. That says something to me. That says that young
Hmm.
people, whether it's true or not, feel that this is something to be scared about. And that's a scary thought for me, because it's not just LGBT young people. Because young people aren't just LGBT. They're also people of
Right.
color. They may identify
Right.
as low income or middle class. They may identify
Hmm.
across the spectrum.
Taking into consideration your experience as a teacher and the technology and your experience working with LGBT youth, what are some of the ways that we can infuse LGBT into our classrooms, into our curriculum, into our instruction, So it's not just simply the counseling piece or the social worker piece or the school psychologist piece.
Yeah, so there are personal entry points to gender. Well, I'll backtrack. When we do this work, we talk about 4 entryways into LGBT issues. The first is the personal, and that's really understanding your own gender and the bias that maybe you have around people who are of a different gender, or even people who are of the same gender but may not fit the same gender expression. So that's that personal realm. And that revolves around asking yourself questions like, what were the earliest messages I received of people who are of a different gender than I am, of a different race? And that personal exploration is really meaningful. The second part is the structural, and that's looking at the systems that are in place at your school. And that's if you don't have a specific transgender policy, maybe it's time to adopt one for your school. If you don't have a student club like a GSA or a Gender and Sexuality Alliance, it may be time to start one to give students a safe place to talk about these issues. What are the structural elements in your school or in your district that are allowing for a safe place to have these conversations or inhibiting these conversations from taking place? The third part, and I think the most meaningful and what gets to your question, is the interpersonal. It's understanding in our everyday interpersonal reactions, we may say or do things that can affirm or can hold young people back. And that's not making assumptions. So when you talk to young people who are talking about going on a date or being really excited or even having a breakup, not making an assumption about who they broke up with or who they're excited to see. Or when you talk to your students, instead of saying ladies and gentlemen or boys and girls, saying things like y'all or my scholars. Don't say things like you guys, because not everybody identifies. And those little things, those interpersonal reactions, add up to something bigger. It's about changing the conversation and the language. The last part is the instructional, which is explicitly teaching young people that there's no one right way to be a boy or a girl, that there are people who are different from us in this world, and it means nothing different for us, it just means that there are different people in the world. Those 4 entry points, that personal, the structural, the interpersonal, and the instructional, those are really the 4 key entry points, and that's where this work starts. But it starts with an individual. We are all individuals that exist in structures that have interpersonal reactions and have instructional components to our day-to-day jobs. So as educators, our first and primary job is to start this journey with ourselves. So I encourage everybody to get to know yourself a little bit more, understand your gender and where that came to play in your life, whether or not your own gender identity has ever held you back or whether it pushed you forward a little bit, whether you had advantages or disadvantages. And from there, you can really help to understand how you can break that down for your young people so that they have those an equal playing field so that they can earn and learn.
That was great.
Jared, I am so envious of your ability to just speak so eloquently and hit so many points, so many salient points, and I'm really floored and green and with envy. So, couldn't be happier to have you.
My
on.
pleasure.
Really,
Thanks for having me. Thanks to both of you. It's been a pleasure to be able to talk with both of you today, and hopefully from here, people want to chat a little bit more. I am on the social media, so I'm at educational, EDUGAYTIONAL. So that's educational, but instead of educational, there's the word gay in the middle, so it's educational. The intersection of both of my lives, LGBT issues and education. That's where I sit.
Well, Marc will put that all up on the website, and I just wanted to thank you very much. It was incredibly helpful, enjoyable to listen to, informative, inspirational, and I will say that the students in New York City are incredibly fortunate to have you in this role.
Thank you. I
Absolutely.
really appreciate that. I
Absolutely.
really appreciate that.
So just some boilerplate information to finish up our show. If you would like to find us online, it's stateofedpodcast.com. And if you have any questions, you can email us at ask@stateofedpodcast.com, or you could find us on Twitter at SOE Podcast. You could also find us on iTunes. Go to the iTunes store and search for us, and please subscribe if you do. And once again, we are just very, very grateful and thankful to have had Jared on our show today, and really just provided so much information and so many wonderful things to think about, and ways to continue the conversation in our own schools and in our own families and in our own communities. Really just an amazing job, someone who's doing incredible work, and just an honor to spend some time with him. So thank you very much, Jared.